Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I've really enjoyed all the amazing ideas yesterday. So I hope that some of what I'm going to say is going to contribute to some of that. So this morning, I want to explore how we can generate hope when everything seems so hopeless. Using examples from my research with eco-communities and environmentalists, I'm going to suggest that we need to start by recognising and processing hopelessness and grief in order to generate the hope which is grounded, active and transformative. So hope here, in my understanding, isn't just something that we have or not, it's something that we actively need to generate and turn into action. So as Charlotte suggested, I'm particularly interested in action, in activism, in what transformative changes are happening, what people are already doing. And I also believe that this is best done as a collective process, so that although I'm not talking about anarchism explicitly, I've realised a bit belatedly that pretty much all the projects I work with are anarchist. So in that kind of like, let's just get on and do it approach, prefigurative action, and let's not wait for the state. It just seemed normal to me, that's why I didn't notice, I think. So despite being in the midst of multiple global crises, there is reason to be hopeful. Alongside a rise of doom, despair, anxiety and hopelessness, there are growing calls for the political choice to be hopeful, to focus on constructive hope and to mobilise climate action. As John Holloway argues, it's the very horror of the world which obliges us to learn to hope. So I've spent much of my academic career detailing and documenting hopeful examples of transformative grassroots environmental change. So that's where I'm starting from. This I took this picture last week. It's a place that I call Green Hills because they don't have planning permission in County Durham. Places where they've just gone and built their own homes, just gone and built their new ways of living without waiting for any kind of permission. So I'm particularly drawn to those projects that might be considered radical, but also creative, inclusive, and making a difference to people's everyday lives. So the sorts of projects that I've done include self-build affordable eco-housing, community living, community-supported agriculture, autonomous urban projects, non-monetary economic exchange systems, and basically infrastructures of self-provision of everything we need to live, but particularly housing, food, water, and energy. So while I've researched the material and social infrastructures of what is produced by these projects, and I've obviously worked with them, hopefully constructively, exploring their failures, exclusions, or unintended consequences, it's only recently that I've really started to investigate the inner change processes that generate and sustain the desire to do this work in the first place. And hope is central in these processes. So although I'm conscious that this is a conference around communication, I first want to step inwards to look at what it means to generate hope as an emotion before coming back to the question of how we might communicate and generate hope as action with others. So there are some starting assumptions. I was very conscious, as Charlotte said, that I'm a geographer and many of you aren't. So I just wanted to share the few assumptions that I'm framing this in. The first is that climate change will, of course, be deeply uneven. So we already know islands in the Pacific are hardest hit, and those of us in the global north have a resilience through the wealth and technology that we already have. But also, of course, climate change is intricately tied into capitalism and ongoing structures of colonialism and racial oppression. Secondly, most of us want to survive and flourish on this earth. So one of the things I feel like I have to say is that, of course, we're driven to survive, and I'm really interested in the ingenuity that generates in humans, often surviving with very little, often being living prefiguratively, living now as we wish the world to be. But as Noelle said yesterday, we're not very good at understanding or respecting our interdependencies with all other living things. So our drive to survive often kind of overrules any sense of, to me, rationality of understanding what enables that to happen. Third, and I will come back to this, but when we talk about hope, we need to distinguish what type of hope we're talking about and calling for. I'm particularly interested in hope that's grounded and active, that is constituted through practices which can be shared. And I want to distinguish that hopeful action from a weaker, unsubstantiated self-belief in hope, a hope that just everything will be okay. If the hope is not shareable, is not grounded in practice, then to me it's quite naive. It's not possible for us to communicate it, then it's not a common experience, and therefore I'm not really sure what it does beyond soothe and suppress our own anxiety. That kind of, I hope it will be okay. I don't see how that helps us. It's a false hope, a self-belief without evidence or action. Fourth, the majority of my work is conducted with environmentalists in the global north, particularly white environmentalists in the UK, USA, and Australia. And I've continued this work this summer. But some of these ideas here were developed explicitly with my colleague Ankit Kumar, who has worked with rural communities in India. And as I'll come on to explain, he's the one who's challenged me to think about hopelessness more. And when we do a duo, I'm the hopeful one and he's the hopeless one. But it comes rooted from his work, particularly in India and the global south, about climate change solution impacts. So I think it's really important to be explicit about what places we're talking from. And I had a lot of great real grounding yesterday in some of the talks of why it matters to this place and what hope means here. So of course, therefore, there's an important spatiality to hope. And finally, I'm a geographer interested in empirical evidence of examples of practices, daily acts, and how people are doing things differently. And I'm not an expert in communication, which is why I'm excited to be here. But if you hear a lack of attention to communication, that's because of my disciplinary grounding, not because of a lack of interest. So I just want to start with just reaffirming that climate change is very uneven, and it's going to impact us in vastly different ways. And we all, I suspect, know how climate change is going to impact us in different areas around the world in detail. So one of my biggest problems with climate change is actually the lack of common recognition of the severity of climate change around the world. I want to say one of my biggest problems is other people. And I say that in the context of England. Those who deny climate change, those who believe that large technological solutions would save us from having to make any alterations. And of course, given the far-right anti-immigrant riots that we've had in Britain in the last few weeks, and ignorance around some of the drivers around immigration in particular. So this is to say that there's a spatiality to the climate crisis that requires a spatialized response, an acknowledgement that action must be multiscalar, but also suitable for that particular place. While some have found hope in international government agreements like COP, many can experience that as a distant and abstracted sense of hope. It can be a hope that also rarely delivers, as we've seen. Lots of people put hope in those processes, then targets are missed, or the speed and severity of climate change rules them, the target's useless. And for me, in many ways, giving hope to large institutional processes is another form of self-soothing. You're handing over agency and responsibility to others rather than retaining hope as action for yourself. So while I'm not advocating that we stop doing international agreements, that's luckily not for me to decide, I'm particularly interested in actions at regional and local scales. And that's because those scales are at a practical level of engagement that generate positive feedback loops. That there's a human scale to the changes that as we make them, they reinforce our choices to make more of them. And to me, that's vital in instigating hopeful action. So I'm interested not just how we might find hope in ourselves, that's a lovely internal process which might make ourselves feel better individually, but how do we generate hope that is grounded, shareable and active? As we know, hope's often being dismissed as naive or crippling. It can foreclose the need for action, actually. It can, we might not see any need to challenge or change what we're already doing. And it's been argued that having hope might mean that we're simply hopeful that humans will be okay. It's a very inactive and passive form of hope, a type of optimistic wishful thinking, a form of positive emotion. It can also be very individual. It's very difficult to share that. We've heard some talks yesterday, what makes people hopeful, and that individual thought might not resonate with anyone else, so it just makes that person feel great. I'm particularly, it doesn't demand any action. So I'm interested in hope as an emotion and action, in hopeful action. Rosa argues that hope is the desire for X, a belief that X is possible but not certain, and a mental emphasis on seeking to achieve X. So hope is something that can only happen, or it might or might not happen, but it can only happen if the hoper works towards it. So it will always require action. Therefore, hope requires the hoper to be involved with their hope. They need to have emotions, thoughts, and plans and actions which revolve around both the desire and the possibility of it coming back. And this builds on Bloch's articulation of hope as a need to actively engage in what is becoming. So for me, hope is an agency and it's a political act. Of course, it's an emotion, but it needs to be more, especially when we're talking about climate change. So hope, as Orr says, is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. Hopeful people are actively engaged with defying or changing the odds. And hope is the fuel for agency. So it is hope as action, hope as political, and hope as a type of agency, which I'd argue is the most useful articulation of hope for climate change. And hope is a cognitive pathway which, when collectivized, provides practical ways towards transformative change. So it can give us the impetus, it can sustain us in this quest towards achieving a demanding goal. Even while it's uncertain, that goal can be achieved. And what I'm really interested, therefore, is how that hope is generated and how the people who have built these amazing eco-communities in the woods out of nothing sustained themselves with that hopeful element through all those years. So Green Hills has now existed for 20 years and the planners still haven't found it, which is good news. I think they've now been there enough that they get squatters' rights. So West uses the term transformative hope to communicate both the centrality of agency to the concept, but also the intended outcome of broader social change. So hope is future goal orientated, and hopers can maintain hope even in the position of improbability. But in many ways, collectively imagining an alternative makes it appear more realizable. And that's, to me, why the collective is so important. So hope is an inner and shared emotion, but it's also an agency, and it's also an impetus for action. That it generates social change, but social change also generates hope. And these are reciprocal, non-linear, and interdependent processes of change, of which hope is central. So how can we generate this hopeful action? How can we do this, especially when many of us already despair about climate change, when so many of us already feel overwhelmed by the scale of the climate crisis, or feel disconnected from images of distant devastation? For a long time, I sought to generate connection with distant others through the concept of geographies of responsibility. It's a very well-known geographical approach where we map how we're all interlinked across the world through colonialism, consumption, fossil fuels, mobility. This process details how and why we should feel responsible for places, like the places where all the components of our mobile phones come from, for example, and how often those are the very same places that we have colonial links to, talking from an English perspective. But of course, that doesn't actually easily generate any feelings of connection. And I found students just felt more burdened by these additional articulations of responsibility. So we had a great conversation the other day with a group of students, and we said, how are your emotions after doing a degree in geography? And they went depressed, hopeless, what we're going to do in the world. And we were like, well, we were teaching you hope. And we kind of missed the bar. So it's really important, I think, that what might make sense intellectually has to be tested. So obviously that didn't work. And I'm now wondering whether we should start by recognizing our disconnections instead. What if we start from understanding loss? So I want to explore two routes that I've been researching empirically that might take us from loss to hope. The first is starting from hopelessness, and the second working through grief and mourning. So hopelessness is quite a common response to climate change, because of the scale, the political inaction, and the uncertainty of our future. And this hopelessness is expressed in a number of different places. This isn't denial, this is acceptance of climate change happening and a response of hopelessness of the extent to which it means. Ankit Kumar argues that it's vital we don't ignore the hopelessness, especially of the already marginalised in the global south. Otherwise, we might engage in new forms of climate colonialism. So it's really important to acknowledge why some people and communities are without hope and how this should challenge hopeful approaches to climate change. He outlines how a focus on hopeful action and the urgency around climate change might end up creating a sense of universalism that then ignores all the senses of difference, justice, rights, and responsibilities that are uneven around the globe. Classic example about 20 years ago in the kind of COP meetings was the US arguing that they didn't need to do anything about climate change until China and India did something about climate change. You know, irrelevant of the different context and responsibility and wealth, etc. But this urgency still creates a space and opportunity for technocratic solutions to be implemented, which are often unjust and benefit the already privileged. These actions might raise hopefulness in tackling climate change, but they foster a hopelessness for justice. An example is the spatiality of big and rapid energy transitions. So there's very few people who are going to say renewable energy systems are bad. And I enjoyed seeing all the wind turbines as I got the train across Netherlands. But the problem isn't that wind turbines themselves, but the way they're framed as global. They're framed as universal and as being hopeful and beneficial for all people, all places, all environments. Yet we now know that it's well established that patterns of extraction of fossil fuels map neatly onto the same mining, production and deployment of renewable energy transitions. So a lot of the special minerals, for example, that we need in solar panels are being extracted in violent colonial ways from exactly the same places that we've already stripped their fossil fuels. And this, of course, creates a huge injustice in the world. So many hopeful climate actions for those of us in the global north, of course, raise hopelessness for climate justice, especially for those in the global south. And obviously I'm being hugely generic with those definitions, but I didn't want to give you a whole lecture on how we argue over that in geography. So hopelessness can also be conceived as a realization of the depth of the crisis the world is in. It's a recognition and the depth of despair from which potentially radically alternative notions of what could be could emerge. So what Ankit and I are arguing is that hopelessness could be a route to radical justice. Expressions of hopelessness to the status quo are a powerful mobilizer of alternative actions. This is evident in the articulations and arguments of some of the young people's strikes for climate change, where Greta Thunberg, for example, has said, "I don't want you hope, I want you to panic." Or "You lied to us, you gave us false hope. You told us the future was something to look forward to. We children are doing this because we want our hopes and dreams back." So what they're doing is saying, we don't trust you anymore. The whole system is wrong. And they might not always articulate it as a critique of capitalism, although I can't remember who yesterday gave a great talk about that and pointed out that it really does critique capitalism. But it also attests to the hopelessness in which young people's school strikes were rooted, a hopelessness in the action of adults. And it was emerging also because they weren't involved in the decisions which would impact the climate they got to live with. So they also had no participation in the decision making. It was a hopelessness in the status quo for intergenerational justice. Yet the school strikes emerged still as a moment of hope through which young people around the world have expressed their agency. They gave people hope for the future. There's a certain utopianism in their actions, a certain inclusivity and radicalism as they refer to climate justice and action for all life on the earth, rather than just humanity. So there's a vibration here between hope and hopelessness. Hopelessness with the state of discourse on climate change leads to a refusal to engage in some of those systems that are oppressing them, refusal to go to school, and taking to the streets instead. And this leads to hope for others. So the very acts of those strikes created a public imaginary in many parts of the world, especially the global north, demonstrating a political power of hopelessness. Another example are Black and people of colour-led projects for survival and Indigenous self-determination. Again, hopelessness is generated here in existing systems that have ignored climate change in the global south and indeed worsened its impact through extractivism and carbon offsetting. Instead, hope is found in Indigenous and Black value systems where they seek to tackle the root causes of climate change and critique the oppressive principles of whiteness. So recently, there have been a number of books coming out by Black authors critiquing white environmentalism, critiquing the way that whiteness is absolutely embedded in how climate change solutions are being operationalized. And that many in the global north haven't cared for the last few decades because climate change mostly impacted the global south. It's only recently, now that we're slightly inconvenienced by floods or heat waves, that we're beginning to take action. So there are numerous examples where hope is alternatively grounded in practical place-based projects that contribute to climate justice. For example, Penniman's work on Black farming calls for a return to Black heritage farming practices and regenerative agriculture. Particularly, she's focused on caring for soil as a form of climate action. She argues it's a form of carbon sequestration and reclaims human health and freedom of self-sufficiency, such that in healing our relationship with soil, we heal the climate and we heal ourselves. So grounded hope emerges from these places, albeit at a limited scale, in response to hopelessness with existing systems of domination, power, and land management. So hopelessness is a form of disengagement with certain processes, a refusal to hope in current systems of governance, and a belief that this hopelessness might force a change in the process. It's a way of abandoning certain ways of being in the world in order to create space for different possibilities. So it's a political stance that says when others talk about hope as a universal, homogenized us, we refuse to play along because of historical and contemporary experience with the universal makes us hopeless. Therefore, we need to work in the messy interstitial relations between hope and hopelessness and recognize hopelessness and the importance of place to center social justice in our responses to climate change. So it's a contingent relation always. When we talk about hope, we're always going to end up talking about hopelessness, either somewhere else or where we have come from. And that, to me, that's really important when we construct hope, to ensure that it's always in a contextual relationship and in contextual relationship with certain places. I also wonder if it might be necessary for us to reach a point of hopelessness, to allow ourselves to reach a point of despair, to have the space and imagination to think through some radical responses. And in many ways, that's what anarchism is encouraging, a realization that the current system isn't going to work and that we have to reach some kind of depth to reject some of the wealth and privilege that many of us might be benefiting from capitalism. The second theme I want to talk about is grief and mourning. And I'm articulating this differently to hopelessness, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I've been exploring what the role of grief and mourning is in order to create the capacity, time and space for radical hopeful action. So I've been working with eco-community residents. So I didn't define this earlier. Those living in eco-villages, low-impact developments, off-grid self-built housing, self-provision, fossil fuel-free living. All examples of deeply radical alternative ways of being. So this is Lilac in Leeds, one of the newer eco-communities. Those are all straw bale houses, and they live a variety of shared lives there. And I've previously explored all the different material and social infrastructures that they've built, like these eco-homes, like the permaculture-based food production, renewable energy systems, water harvesting. And I've been really interested in the practical, what can we build, what can we create? And the residents I spoke to articulated always a strong sense of hope in these new infrastructures, that these changes enabled them to sustain and reinforce other hopeful actions. So unsurprisingly, these places then become hopeful bases for other activism like Extinction Rebellion and a variety of other griefs. But some also reflected that since moving to an eco-village, they no longer experienced hopelessness. They found hope in their everyday lives and in sharing their lives with those in the community. They spoke of the joy and power of collective action. And I thought, well, that's very nice for you. We're never all going to live in these places. So what could we learn from that? When I asked them to reflect on their journey from hopelessness they'd previously experienced and the hope they now have, what emerged was a huge sense of grief, mourning, and loss. A recognition that the future many of us grew up imagining no longer exists, and the present is shifting in unsettling ways. So they grieve for their lost expectations, for nature, and for themselves. They grieve for lost relationships, lost relations, a lack of connection, and a lack of interdependence. And they argue that pausing to grieve is vital to avoid continuing to replicate existing extractive and destructive ways of thinking, acting, and living. That creating this space of grief enabled them to let go of how they thought their lives might have been, of acknowledging the losses caused by climate change, of mourning the destructive nature of capitalism. That they argued we needed to identify the thing we're mourning and let it go so that we're no longer trapped by it. So this grief and mourning was experienced as a release, an acceptance of what is lost, which enabled the residents to then move on. It was a freeing from old ways of being, thinking, and doing. It was a liberation from despair, a purposeful choice to be differently. And it was only by processing this grief they were able to find the space, capacity, and drive to put their ingenuity and energy into experiencing alternative ways of living. So just to explain, because this might look a bit random, this was a workshop where we were using clay to create an object that meant a lot to us, and then we went and placed it in a hedgerow to let it go. So a lot of us were like, whoa, and then it turned out to be a lot of fun. So these were all our different objects, and it didn't have to make sense to anyone else, a bit like the art workshop yesterday afternoon. It just had to make sense to us. But it was a way of thinking what was important, and then a process of letting go. And so there've been a lot of different, I'm particularly interested, therefore, in the processes being employed here, not just saying to everyone, go and grieve, but how. Many of us aren't taught how to grieve. Many of us are in cultures that just shut it down. So there's in the middle of identifying a lot of the different processes, but it includes mindfulness, non-violent communication, identifying, reflecting, and mourning for needs unmet, body work, so all the kind of, not just the yoga, but the somatic exercises that they label you to perhaps tap feelings you can't articulate, self-compassion. At Earth Haven in North Carolina, where I went in May, they have particularly very extravagant, to me, that sounds very judgmental, my non-judgmental language gone, days-long mourning periods when someone dies, and a lot of different rituals around it. And it very much contrasted for me with my childhood, where you go to a crematorium and 10 minutes later you're done. But actually they had a huge variety of processes and a collective celebration of death. And then also gratitude and thankfulness for what is being killed or consumed. There was a lot of thankfulness, which I didn't understand initially. I thought, well, they're very polite. It's like being in England, but I'm not understanding what I'm thanking. But you thank the tree before you chop it down. So you acknowledge the loss that you are then participating in. But crucially, these are all collective practices or guided by a facilitator. They're a process that make more sense when done together, because you only let others hear you, and also you learn from others' experience. So what's the difference between hopelessness and grief? And I just want to touch on that, because to the extent that hopelessness is a repetitive attachment, an entrapment without movement, to that extent it isn't a choice. And that's why I think we need to be really careful when we're having calls for hope, that actually lots of people are going to have a hopelessness. That's not a mental condition you switch out of. Oh, okay, you've told me to have hope, then I will. It's not a choice. Whereas grieving and mourning, we can choose to engage in those processes. We're going to start from a different point. So as Freud argued, we need to engage in the labor, the work of mourning, in order to give up the lost object. And I'm arguing that this is a political labour that's necessary response to climate change. Both processes are valuable, however you come to it, but actually it really depends where you're starting. So starting from loss, be that hopefulness or grief, and recognising their contingent relations with hope, deepens and grounds hopeful action. And recognising loss enables the identification of what's not working, of what needs to be changed or abandoned, or what transformation is required. Loss acknowledges not just the severity of climate change, but its spatiality, that we'll each have a different positionality, different reasons for hopelessness, or different things to grieve for. Through loss, what is wanted and needed, such as greater recognition of our interdependence with more than humans, can be identified and hoped for. So again, some of the practices that I've been participating in these communities, the first thing that you grieve for often isn't the actual thing you're grieving for. So it is a kind of process of counselling or whatever, but it's trying to get to what the real thing is in order to fully acknowledge what you're missing in life. So this hopelessness of grief always contains a potential for being and living otherwise, and it creates conditions for change by identifying not just what is no longer possible, but also what it is that you really need to survive. So it avoids the risk of homogenized, universal and untethered hope by grounding and placing us. So I did promise I'd return to the question of communication, and I'm interested in how these different approaches to thinking and talking about climate change, particularly hopelessness and grief, contribute towards how we communicate for social transformation. I also want to say that if we understand hope as agency, then of course we can conceive of communication as a political agency. Or if we conceive of hope as community, then also hope is communication. It's the act of being held in common, which generates hope. So if the aim of communication is to generate hopeful action, I want to make 4 tentative suggestions. The first is that we must be explicit about what type of hope we're encouraging and to what ends. What is the hopeful action we're sharing and why? Where are we trying to get to? We're not just trying to smooth and smother our emotions so we all feel better about the world. Well, we might be. I'm suggesting that's not very productive. Second, to recognise the importance of hopelessness and grief and mourning in what might enable us to become hopeful and create space for that to be acknowledged in how we communicate. Third, I really want us to reflect on what place hope emerges from and the consequences of that hope on other places, especially the global south, to ensure that we're tethering hope to very specific places. We're very clear about what we're talking about, what examples work in particular places. And it's not just technological solutions that don't travel well. In my research on eco-homes, I went to southern Spain and a lot of Brits moved there, much nicer weather. But what they've done was taken the radical self-build straw bale construction with them. Works really well in Northern Europe. Doesn't work in a hot, slightly damp climate. And then they were surprised that it had gone mouldy and it was too hot. It was just a classic example of thinking that solutions are universal. And it was a bit of a hard lesson. So finally, I think that we need to do 1, 2, and 3 before we share examples of what we think hopeful action looks like. So the other version of this talk that I started was me standing up and telling you how great eco-communities are and all the things they do. And then I realized that was kind of missing the point when we talk about hope, because that only really applies to those of us who want to go and live in those communities. And that's great. Let's do more of that. But what does that help in terms of the rest of the world, or those of us who want to live differently to that? So I think that we can use this approach to then reflect on the multiple forms of practices already being employed, many of them shared in this conference, such as literature, songs, animation, storytelling, community rituals, regenerative circles, etc., to consider how hope is being understood and shared. So of course, if these conversations around grief and mourning are new and unsettling, then we need really good practices that help people feel comfortable in that. And this is an example from the Intentional Community, UK Intentional Communities Conference in early July, where the facilitator here was trying to get us to think about values differently and what really mattered to us, in order then to work out what we might want to do about it. So it's almost a process of working out what you're going to give up to get what you want. So hope as action tethered to particular places and with space for hopelessness, and more important than a weaker, passive and tethered hope that assumes universal benefits for all. And I'm just going to conclude. Hope is most useful if understood as hopeful action, something that might happen if the hoper works towards it, but it requires a mental emphasis to seek to achieve it. It can't be passively achieved. So hope also needs to be placed tethered to specific locations and contexts. And to avoid the risks of hope, the naivety and the passivity of optimism, we need to acknowledge the importance of hopelessness and refusal. It's vital that we engage with hopeful action critically, that we also, when we talk or hear hope, we go, where are you talking about? Where does that come from? What does that mean? How does it practice? And is it shareable with others? So there's also, I think, a need to experience hopelessness or grief in order to find the necessary radical politics of hopeful and just climate action, and understand hope and hopelessness and grief always in constant tension with each other. That's almost what gives them their energy, because it's a contrast constantly of where we are and where we hope to be. So I think giving space and time to recognise and process hopelessness and grief, to give up the loss of an object of desire, is necessary in order to be future orientated. We need to break the cycles of repetition that we're currently living in order to conceive of the future differently. Really importantly, I don't think this process needs to be sad. So I've talked a lot about hopelessness and grief and mourning, and of course that raises all sorts of different emotions for us. One of the things I've noticed in British eco-communities is a huge sense of humour and sarcasm, and that learning to grieve and communicate and let go can be fun and involve laughter and enjoyment. This is Beth, and at Green Hills, and she was teaching us non-violent communication. If those of you who know it, there's the giraffe and the jackal. But it was a very fun workshop, actually, where we were trying to understand our own needs and then communicate them. And most of us really messed it up. Most of us with the jackal kind of attacking the giraffe. What I mean to say is, this isn't about being solemn. That actually what we need as humans is to connect with each other through our full range of emotions. That it's not about depressing each other, it's about processing those feelings, and that can involve quite a lot of collective fun. And a lot of those collective fun moments come through a fascinating range of practices, rituals, bodywork, and languages to support this. So I think we need to be really specific when we're communicating hope and using communication as hope, that we're employing hope as agency when we communicate, and we need to ensure what type and place hopeful action is for. And given all the examples of hopeful action that already exist, very few of which I've shared with you, sorry, but there are out there, I remain hopeful that together we can generate a hopeful future. And there's another example here at the top, that's an XR regenerative culture process of circle of hope, and again a tension here between hopelessness and action in XR. Thank you.